The devil in the locked room, marked by the devil's sign. They say the mark chooses those already haunted. It doesn't appear on the skin of the innocent, but on the souls of those who have danced too close to the darkness and called it curiosity. It begins as a faint, bloodless brand, a sigil of intersecting lines and spirals that feels cold to the touch. And with it comes the rule, whispered on a breath of frozen air. Once the mark appears on your skin, the devil owns your soul for 7 nights. The locked room is not the mystery, it is the stage. The true mystery is what he does with you when the door is sealed, and why, when the 7th night passes, the lock is still engaged from the inside, but only silence or something wearing your face remains. The first time Leo Mercer saw the mark, he was elbow deep in a theory about sewer drainage and a missing persons case from 1987. The blue light of his dual monitors was the only illumination in his apartment, the silence broken by the rhythmic tap of his keyboard and the distant sigh of city traffic 5 stories below. A shiver skated down his spine, abrupt and sharp, like an ice cube dropped down his back. He paused, fingers hovering over the keys. The room hadn't gotten colder. He rubbed his left forearm absently where a strange, localized numbness had begun to prickle. Frowning, he pushed back from the desk and rolled up the sleeve of his worn flannel shirt. On the pale skin of his inner forearm, just below the crook of his elbow, was a shape. It wasn't a rash, it wasn't a bruise, it was a design. A series of intersecting lines, sharp and geometric, spiraled into a central point that looked disturbingly like a stylized, lidless eye. The lines were faint, a grayish-white against his skin, as if drawn with a needle dipped in frost. They were perfectly precise. He pressed a finger to it. Cold. A deep, penetrating cold that seemed to leach the warmth from his fingertip. "What the hell?" he muttered to the empty room. Leo Mercer was a man of processed evidence and cataloged facts. A former forensic investigator, now the host of the moderately successful podcast Unsealed: The Locked Room, he spent his life deconstructing mysteries until they yielded their mundane, human truths. His world was one of fiber evidence, toxicology reports, and the flawed psychology of people who thought they could outsmart physics. This was not in his lexicon. He strode to the bathroom, flipping on the harsh fluorescent light. In the mirror, his face looked tired, dark hair mussed, 5 o'clock shadow edging towards a beard, eyes a weary hazel. He held his arm under the light. The mark remained, stark and alien. He scrubbed at it with soap and hot water until the skin was red and raw. The mark didn't fade. It didn't smudge. It looked, if anything, darker. Stress, his rational mind insisted, clinging to the lifeline. A bizarre dermatological reaction. You've been living on coffee and conspiracy theories for 3 months straight. He returned to his desk, but the words on the screen blurred. The cold from the mark seeped up his arm, a constant nagging presence. He finally gave up, shutting down his research with a frustrated sigh. He needed sleep, that was all. Sleep, however, had other plans. He dreamt of a corridor. It was endless, wallpapered in a faded burgundy damask that smelled of dust and old perfume. Doors lined both sides, heavy, dark wood, each with an ornate, tarnished brass knob and a keyhole black as a pupil. All were locked. His footsteps were silent on the threadbare runner. The only sound was a distant, rhythmic drip of water. From behind one door, just ahead on the left, a voice seeped through the wood grain. It was not a scream, not a roar. It was a whisper, smooth and intimate, as if the speaker had their lips pressed to the keyhole. 6 nights left, Leo. He froze, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. We'll start small. The whisper held a smile in it, a terrible, indulgent smile. Leo jolted awake in his own bed, gasping for air. The digital clock on his bedside table glowed 3:33 a.m. His skin was slick with a cold sweat, but the deeper chill was in his bones, radiating from the mark on his arm. The dream clung to him, viscous and real. And then he smelled it, faint but unmistakable beneath the scent of his own fear, the sweet, coppery tang of blood. His eyes darted around the moonlit room. Nothing seemed out of place. The familiar shapes of his dresser, his chair, the stack of books by the door. His bedroom door, which he never locked, was closed. On instinct, he threw off the covers and walked to it, the floorboards cold under his bare feet. He grasped the knob. It turned freely. He pulled. The door didn't budge. A jolt of pure adrenaline shot through him. He yanked the door harder, rattling it in its frame. It was locked, not just stuck, locked from the inside. The deadbolt, a simple thumb turn, was engaged. He hadn't touched it. He never used it. Stumbling back, his mind raced through explanations. Sleepwalking, a faulty mechanism, a prank? But he lived alone. The apartment was secure. His breath came in short, sharp clouds in the suddenly frigid air. He turned, scanning the room again, his forensic eye cataloging, analyzing. Everything was normal, except the small black shape on his white pillowcase. He approached slowly. It was a fly, an ordinary housefly. It lay perfectly still, legs curled tight against its body. Not sleeping, dead. He stared at it, the dream voice echoing in his skull. We'll start small. The first hook was set. The mystery was no longer out there in a police file or a cold case archive. It was here, in his locked room, on his skin and on his pillow. And Leo Mercer, the solver of puzzles, had just become the subject of one. The girl in the asylum. The lock yielded to a screwdriver and a forceful twist of the deadbolt mechanism, revealing nothing more sinister than his empty, silent hallway. Leo spent the remaining hours until dawn methodically examining his apartment. He found no signs of entry, no hidden devices, no logical reason for the lock to have been engaged. The dead fly was bagged and set aside, an absurd piece of evidence in a case with no crime scene. By the gray light of morning, the event had taken on the quality of a bad dream. The mark, however, remained. It had deepened in color overnight. Now the shade of an old bruise, the spirals seeming to pulse faintly with his heartbeat. He covered it with a long-sleeved Henley, a simple act of concealment that felt like the first step into a lie. Work was his anchor. He buried himself in research, not for the podcast, but for himself. His search parameters were broad and unsettling: unexplained skin markings, folklore of spiritual contracts, 7-day curses. The results were a swamp of superstition and paranoid forum posts, worthless to his trained mind. It was a tangential thread that finally caught. While cross-referencing historical accounts of possession with documented mental health episodes, he stumbled upon a digitized archive from the Blackwood Sanatorium. The asylum, a Gothic monstrosity shuttered since the 1950s, was infamous in true crime circles for its lax records and rumored abuses. Among the scanned patient intake forms and faded physician notes was a personal item: the journal of Ilara Moss. She had been admitted in 1919, not a patient but a graduate student in psychology from Radcliffe, conducting authorized research on the effects of isolation. Her journal entries began with clinical detachment, detailing the architecture, the routines, the profiles of certain patients. Then the tone shifted. October 23rd, 1919. A most peculiar incident with subject number 7, Mr. Albright. He claims a cold brand appeared on his hand after sleepwalking into the disused West Wing. He is incoherent, fixated on the number 7. The mark is visible, a pattern of lines, non-inflammatory. It resists scrubbing. Hysteria manifesting as dermatological symptom, perhaps. October 27th. I dreamed of a long haul last night. I woke feeling watched. This morning, on my own wrist, I see it, the same pattern. Coincidence? Suggestion? It is cold to the touch. Mr. Albright was found in his room this morning, catatonic. He whispers one phrase, 6 nights left. Leo's own heart throbbed, a sudden, sharp icicle jab beneath his skin. He pulled up his sleeve. The sigil seemed to glare back at him from the screen's glow. He read faster, his breath tight in his chest. Ilara's entries grew frantic, her script deteriorating from elegant cursive to a spidered scrawl.
October 30th. It is not a delusion. It is a transaction. The mark is the signature. The terms are clear in the dreaming. 7 nights of ownership. The room is the crucible. It prefers the locked door. The horror is not in the breach, but in the presence that needs no breach. November 1st. I have moved my cot into the old treatment room. A solid door. A key I can hold. A foolish attempt at a controlled environment. If I must endure this, I will document it. It speaks without sound. It shows me private things. My father's disappointment, my mother's illness. It feeds on the shame. The final entry was a single terror-smeared paragraph dated November 4th. It is the 7th night. I hear it in the walls. It is not outside. It is in here with me. It has been here all along, wearing my memories like a skin. The room was locked from inside, but the screams proved something evil was already there. It is not trying to get in. It is waiting for me to realize I cannot get out. God forgive. The scan ended abruptly. A following note from the archives stated that Ilara Moss had vanished from the locked treatment room on the night of November 4th. The door was found still locked from the inside, the key on the floor beside her empty cot. The only item missing was her journal, which was discovered years later during demolition, wedged in a chimney flue, these final pages preserved. Leo sat back, the hum of his computer the only sound in the room. A perfect locked room mystery, a historical curiosity, a tragic young woman succumbing to psychosis, her research blending with her delusion. But the cold brand on his arm told a different story. Driven by a compulsion he couldn't name, he navigated to the forum for his own podcast, Unsealed. It was a modest community of armchair detectives and mystery enthusiasts. He rarely posted, but he lurked. He typed Blackwood Sanatorium into the search bar. Most of the results were familiar: debates about patient treatments, ghost stories, speculation on Ilara Moss's fate. But one new thread, posted just 3 hours ago, made his blood freeze. The subject line read, "For the host of Unsealed." The user was 7 Nights. The post contained no text, only an embedded grainy image. It was a photograph of a door, a heavy dark wood door with an ornate tarnished brass knob. It was the door from his dream. Below the image, in the comments section, 7 Nights had written a single line. "He doesn't like witnesses. You've been seen. The countdown starts at first sight." His fingers flew over the keys. He clicked the user's profile. It was blank. created today. He hit reply, his message terse and professional. What do you mean? What countdown? What is the mark? He clicked post. The page refreshed. A red error banner flashed across the screen. User 7 Nights does not exist. This thread has been removed. He stared at the empty space where the post had been. He checked his browser history. The link was dead. He searched the forum again. Nothing. It had been erased, as completely as the whisper in his dream. The chill from the mark was no longer just on his skin. It was in the very air of his apartment, in the digital ether around him. He wasn't just researching a mystery anymore. He was in a dialogue with it. And the other party had just issued a chilling, unambiguous warning. The countdown, he understood with a dread that settled deep into his marrow, had already begun. He was on night 2, 5 left, and something had just confirmed it knew his name.
The invitation. The paranoia was a living thing. It coiled in Leo's gut as he double-checked the deadbolt on his apartment door, as he scrutinized the faces of strangers on the street, as he watched his own digital shadow for another flicker from 7 Nights. 2 days had passed since the forum post vanished. The mark on his arm had settled into a permanent, gray etching, cold as a scalpel against his skin. He found himself unconsciously covering it, a gesture that felt less like concealment and more like containing a leak. He tried to normalize it. He recorded a podcast episode on the Blackwood Sanatorium, sticking strictly to the documented facts, Alara Moss's academic work, the asylum's controversial history, the cold case of her disappearance. He presented the locked room as a tragic, likely explainable mystery. He never mentioned the journal's specifics about the mark. He certainly didn't mention his own. Hearing his own voice, steady and analytical, was a small comfort. It was the voice of the man he used to be. The comfort shattered on the 3rd morning. A small, cream-colored package sat on the floor of his building's modest lobby, nestled between a flyer for a Thai restaurant and a stack of free community papers. It was addressed with stark, elegant calligraphy and jet black ink. Mr. Leo Mercer, apartment 5B, for his eyes only. No return address, no postage. It had been hand-delivered. Leo's forensic mind snapped online, overriding the chill of dread. He didn't touch it. He took a picture with his phone. He fetched a pair of latex gloves from his investigation kit upstairs. Back in his apartment, with the door securely locked, a habit now ingrained, he placed the package on his kitchen table under the bright pendant light. It was a stiff, linen-wrapped parcel, tied with a simple black cord. Using tweezers, he carefully undid the knot and peeled back the fabric. Inside, resting on a bed of wood shavings that smelled faintly of cedar and something older, myrrh perhaps, were 2 objects. The first was a key. It was heavy, solid brass, aged to a dull greenish patina. Its bow was ornate, fashioned into a complex interlocking design that made his eyes ache slightly to follow. The teeth were long, sharp, and unique. This was not a key for a modern lock. The second was a postcard, a vintage sepia-toned photograph of the Grand Victoria Hotel in its heyday, a behemoth of Gilded Age grandeur, all arched windows, wrought iron balconies, and a canopy stretching over a carpeted entrance. Someone had drawn a precise, inky X over one of the upper floor windows. On the reverse, in the same elegant script as the address, was a message. Mr. Mercer, your distinguished work on the locked room paradox has not been unnoticed. Room 707 of the Grand Victoria Hotel, reopening shortly under new management, presents a singular opportunity for applied study. Your insights are uniquely required. Absolute discretion and anonymity guaranteed. Compensation, as you will find, will be commensurate with the profundity of the revelation.
We await your investigation. The curators. Leo's heart hammered against his ribs. The Grand Victoria. He knew it. A decaying landmark on the city's periphery, a subject of failed renovation rumors for decades. A quick online search confirmed a bland press release. The hotel had been quietly purchased 6 months ago by Vesper Holdings, with a soft reopening scheduled in exactly 1 week. 7 days, 7 nights. He picked up the brass key. It was ice cold, colder than the room, colder than metal had any right to be. The cold seemed to travel up his arm and resonate with the mark, which pulsed once, a deep, unpleasant throb. This was a lure. It was transparent, blatant even. It was a hook baited with the one thing he could not resist, a locked room. They'd read his work. They knew his obsession. The Curators. The name was pretentious, theatrical. It implied collection, display. It made his skin crawl. He thought of Alara Moss moving her cot into the treatment room, a foolish attempt at a controlled environment. Was this the same? If the entity, the host, needed a locked room and needed his consent of a sort to enter, was this invitation a way to formalize the ritual, to get him to willingly step into the cage? His rational mind fought back. Vesper Holdings was likely a shell company. This could be an elaborate prank by a fan or a rival podcaster, or some wealthy eccentric with a taste for macabre games. The key could be a prop. The postcard was easy to find. The connection to his mark could be confirmation bias, his terrified mind stitching patterns where none existed. He placed the key on the table. It left a faint, damp circle of condensation on the wood. Then he went to his desk, opened a deep drawer, and pulled out Alara Moss's journal transcript. He found the entry from October 30th, her words bleeding through the decades. The terms are clear in the dreaming. 7 nights of ownership. The room is the crucible. It prefers the locked door. Room 707. A crucible. He looked at the key. An invitation. A summons. A challenge. They were offering him a front-row seat to the very phenomenon he was trying to understand, to study it, to document it, to solve it. The part of him that was still a forensic investigator, that needed to pick apart the how and why, screamed at the opportunity. It was the ultimate locked room. The other part of him, the part that woke up smelling blood, that felt the alien cold in his bones, knew it was a trap, a beautifully baited, perfectly personalized trap. He had a choice. He could burn the key in the postcard, pack a bag, and drive as far as his savings would take him. He could try to outrun a curse that had already marked him. Or he could walk into the heart of it, recording equipment in hand, and meet the mystery head-on. The mark throbbed again, a silent, insistent timer. Leo Mercer looked at the cold brass key, then at his gloved hands. He thought of screams in a locked room, and of the silence that followed. He was not a man of faith, but he was a man of proof, and right now, the only proof of the nightmare was on his skin and in his hands. He picked up the key. The cold was absolute. He didn't put it down. He began to pack.
Night 1. The Echo. The Grand Victoria did not so much welcome guests as absorb them. Leo stood under the cavernous, dust-choked portico, the key a cold, heavy secret in his coat pocket. The soft reopening was a fiction. No bellhops, no gleaming brass, no scent of polish. Just a single, flickering sconce above doors of scarred oak and a handwritten note taped to the glass. By appointment only. Ring and await curator. He rang the bell. Its distant, mournful clang echoed in the emptiness beyond. After a full minute, a bolt slid back with a sound like a grinding tooth. The door opened just wide enough to reveal a man in an impeccably tailored but old-fashioned suit. He was cadaverously thin, with silver hair combed straight back and eyes the color of a winter sky. He did not smile. "Mr. Mercer, we have been expecting you." His voice was dry, precise, devoid of warmth. "I am Mr. Vale, the curator for this evening. Your belongings will be taken to the room. Please follow me." There was no offer to take Leo's bag, which held his recording equipment, personal effects, and a growing sense of existential regret. Vale simply turned and glided into the gloom of the grand lobby. Leo followed, his footsteps echoing on the vast marble floor. Dust sheets shrouded furniture like dormant ghosts. A grand staircase swept upwards into darkness. The air was still and frigid, carrying the faint, sweet-wrought smell of aged wood and abandoned dreams. "The hotel is in a state of restoration," Vale said, not looking back. "You will be undisturbed in the West Wing. Room 707 is prepared. The terms of your investigation are simple. You may examine the room as you wish. The door locks from the inside. You will not be interrupted for 7 nights. Meals will be delivered to the outer landing at scheduled times. Do not attempt to leave the wing before your investigation is complete." "Or what?" Leo asked, the defiance in his voice sounding hollow in the vast space. Vale stopped at the foot of the service stairs. He turned his head just slightly. "Or the terms of our agreement are void. The compensation, of course, and the anonymity we guarantee regarding your condition." His pale eyes flickered to Leo's coat sleeve as if he could see the mark beneath the wool. "The elevator is not operational. The stairs, please." 7 flights. The climb was a silent, breathless ordeal. The wallpaper peeled in long, skeletal fingers. The only light came from weak, caged bulbs at each landing. Leo's sense of being buried alive intensified with each step. Finally, they reached a narrow, carpeted hallway. Only one door was visible, 707 at the very end. The other doors, he noted, seemed to have been bricked over, their outlines just visible beneath layers of plaster and paint. The hallway itself was a cul-de-sac. "Your cell phone will have no signal," Vale stated, as if commenting on the weather. "The landline in the room is disconnected. This is to ensure absolute focus for your work. Your meals will be left here." He indicated a small, polished side table by the stairs. "We wish you a productive investigation." With a final, slight incline of his head, Vale turned and descended the stairs, his form melting into the shadows. Leo was alone in the silent corridor, the only sound the frantic drumming of his own heart. Room 707 was unlocked. He pushed the heavy door open. It was a chamber of faded opulence. High ceilings with water-stained plaster medallions, a large 4-poster bed with curtains of moth-eaten velvet, a marble fireplace, cold and empty, a worn Persian carpet over dark floorboards, a writing desk, a vanity with a large tarnished mirror, and 2 wing-back chairs flanking a small table. It felt less like a hotel room and more like a stage set for a period drama about consumption. And it was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that the dusty radiator under the window couldn't possibly combat. First, the ritual of the rational. He spent 2 hours on a meticulous inspection. He checked the windows, sealed shut, painted over. The fireplace flue, blocked with a heavy metal grate, bolted from the inside. The walls, solid plaster and lathe, no hollow sounds. The floorboards, firm, no hidden compartments. The ceiling, intact. The closet, empty, its back wall solid. There was a small adjoining bathroom with a clawfoot tub and no windows. Finally, the door. It was thick oak with a heavy iron deadbolt and a brass privacy latch. Both operated smoothly from the inside. Once locked, the room was a sealed box. Satisfied, or as satisfied as he could be, he set up his equipment. A camera on a tripod in the corner, aimed to capture most of the room. Another, smaller one facing the bed. An audio recorder with a sensitive, omnidirectional microphone on the desk. A digital thermometer. He activated everything, the tiny red LEDs glowing like watchful eyes in the gloom. He locked the door. The thunk of the deadbolt engaging was the loudest sound he'd heard in hours. It felt final. Night fell. The room grew darker, the shadows from the single low-wattage bedside lamp stretching and merging. The digital thermometer's reading began to drop steadily. 16 degrees Celsius, 12 degrees Celsius, 8 degrees Celsius. His breath plumed in the air. He sat at the desk, his notes before him, trying to document the mundane. 1945, secured room, temperature anomaly noted, no auditory or visual phenomena. At precisely 3 a.m., the microphone on the desk picked up the first sound, a whisper of static, rising to a susurrus that resolved faintly into words. Leo, who had been dozing fitfully in a chair, jerked awake. He stared at the recorder, its VU meter dancing. The voice from his dream filled the room, emerging from the air itself, synchronized perfectly with the words forming in his mind. "Let's become acquainted, Leo." It was smooth, conversational, intimate. It came from everywhere and nowhere. "I so enjoy the minds of the rational, the architecture you build to keep out the dark. Let's see how the foundations hold." Leo lunged for the camera, checking the viewfinder. The room was empty, just him alone, staring wildly into the middle distance. On the audio feed, clear as day, was the voice, and his own ragged breathing. "What are you?" Leo demanded, his voice cutting through the cold air. "The other party to your contract, the curator of this particular collection. You may call me the host. This is my gallery, and you are the newest exhibit." A wave of dizziness hit him. He stumbled towards the vanity, gripping its edges for support. He looked up into the tarnished mirror. His reflection looked back, pale, terrified, eyes wide. But as Leo watched, his reflection did not mirror his frantic grip on the furniture. It slowly, deliberately straightened up. It smoothed his flannel shirt, and then it smiled. A calm, horribly indulgent smile that Leo's own face had never, could never, make. In the real world, Leo Mercer screamed. In the mirror, his reflection tilted its head, listening apparently with pleasure to a sound it could possibly be making. The audio recorder captured it all, the scream, raw and human, and beneath it, on a separate, impossible channel, the soft, approving chuckle of the host. Dawn came, a gray, grudging light seeping through the painted window. The temperature slowly climbed back to normal. The audio feed returns to baseline silence. Exhausted, trembling, Leo checked the cameras. The footage showed only him, inspecting the room, sitting at the desk, dozing, then suddenly starting awake, staring at nothing, stumbling to the mirror and screaming at his own reflection. There was no other voice, no separate audio track, just Leo Mercer alone in a locked room, coming slowly, violently unglued. The door was still locked from the inside. The first night was over. The host had introduced itself. It had shown him the rules. The game was not about proving a physical presence. It was about dismantling a mind. Leo played back the footage of his reflection smiling. He watched it again and again, a cold, professional part of him analyzing the impossible data. The reflection's movements were smooth, natural, not a glitch, a performance. He entered the room to investigate a locked room mystery. He instead became one. The door was locked. The horror was not outside trying to get in. It was in the mirror. It was in the recording. It was in the architecture of his own crumbling mind.
Night 2. The Taste of Fear. Daylight in room 707 was a liar. It revealed the same faded furnishings, the same dust motes dancing in thin slots of light through the painted window, the same solid, immutable locks. It showed no trace of the thing that had spoken from the cold air or smiled from the mirror. The audio files, when Leo listened back, contained only his own voice, his own scream. The separate, chilling track of the host's commentary had vanished, as if it had never been recorded, only heard. This was the true cruelty, Leo realized. The daylight offered the illusion of sanity. It allowed him to doubt what he had experienced. Stress-induced auditory and visual hallucination, paranoia, isolation psychosis. The terms were a comforting blanket. He could almost believe them. Almost. The mark on his arm was a raised wheel now, like a brand healed wrong. It pulsed with a slow, cold rhythm, out of sync with his heartbeat, and the memory of the reflection's smile was etched deeper than any scar. The day was a grueling routine of forced normalcy. He reviewed his notes, ate the bland, cold meal left on the hall table, lamb stew congealed, and tried to rest. Sleep was a fractured thing, filled with jumbled images of endless corridors. He awoke more tired than when he lay down. As dusk bled into the room, the temperature began its predictable descent. Leo felt a change in the atmosphere. Night 1 had been an introduction, a demonstration of power. Night 2, the host had implied, would be different. We'll start small. He was at the desk checking his equipment batteries when it began, not with a voice, but with a scent. The faint, elegant fragrance of jasmine and vanilla, his sister Clara's signature perfume. It was so vivid, so perfectly her that his head snapped up, heart clenching. For a dizzying second, he was 10 years younger, waiting for her to come home. The scent deepened, then twisted. Under the floral sweetness, a darker note emerged, the acrid, choking smell of smoke. Not wood smoke, but the toxic plume of burning synthetics in flesh. The smell of the warehouse fire that had taken her. It filled his nostrils, his throat, coating his tongue with the taste of ash and grief. Leo gagged, stumbling to his feet. "Stop it!" he croaked. Memory is a sense, Leo, the host's voice murmured, not from the air this time, but from the space just behind his left ear. He whirled. Nothing. It has taste. It has scent. It can be curated, relived. The room seemed to warp. The shadows in the corner didn't just darken, they thickened, pulling the light into them. From that darkness, images flickered, not fully formed but felt. The crushing weight of his father's silence after the funeral, the pity in the eyes of his colleagues when he left the force, the face of a missing child from an early case, forever unresolved, a personal failure he carried like a stone. Guilt is such a nourishing vintage, the host mused, its tone that of a connoisseur. Complex, layered. You have a particularly fine cellar, Leo. They're my memories, Leo snarled, backing against the cold wall as if he could press himself through it. You have no right. I have every right. The mark is the receipt. I own the inventory. The sensory assault shifted. The ash taste in his mouth mutated. He looked at the half-finished glass of water on the nightstand. His thirst was suddenly overwhelming. He grabbed the glass, raised it to his lips, and drank. It was not water. It was thick, coppery, and warm. Blood. He spat it out in a violent spray, retching, the metallic tang flooding his senses. The glass fell from his hand, shattering on the floorboards, but what splashed up was clear, ordinary water. The mind informs the palate, the host whispered, now from the direction of the bed. What you believe, you experience. Do you believe you are being poisoned, Leo? Do you believe you deserve it? This was the game. This was starting small. It wasn't about grandiose apparitions. It was about violating the basic, trusted interface between self and world. Taste, smell, memory, comfort. It was about making his own mind a weapon against him. He fled to the bathroom, slamming the door shut, a futile gesture, but a human one. He turned on the faucet, splashed his face. The water was ice cold and blessedly, simply water. He gripped the porcelain sink, staring at his drained, haunted face in the medicine cabinet mirror. His own lips moved. "You'll never solve me," his reflection said, but the voice was the host's, using his vocal cords in the glass. "You'll just come apart piece by piece, and I will catalog each fragment. The rationalist's descent is my favorite collection." Leo slammed his fist into the mirror. It cracked, webbing his shattered reflection into a dozen terrified pieces. Silence. He stood there, breathing heavily, hand throbbing, a single trickle of blood, his own real blood, winding down his wrist. The sensory horrors had stopped. The room was just cold and quiet. He returned to the main room, avoiding the broken glass. The night dragged on, each minute an eternity of anticipation. But the host was done for now. It had made its point. It could feed more than fear. It could feed on sorrow, on regret, on the very essence of what made him him. As the first gray light of dawn touched the window, Leo did not feel relief. He felt hollowed out, scraped raw. The investigation was a sham. He wasn't studying a phenomenon. He was being digested by one. He looked at his recording equipment, the red lights like accusing eyes. What was he documenting? His own breakdown? He played back the last hour of audio. It captured his gagging, his choked words, the sound of the glass breaking, his fist hitting the mirror. To any listener, it would be the sound of a man alone, losing his mind. The door was still locked from the inside. He had survived night 2, but he understood now that survival wasn't the point. Consumption was, and the host, he feared, was only just beginning its meal.
Night 3. The unlocking. The silence after night 2 was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a predator digesting. Leo spent the daylight hours in a state of raw, nerved exhaustion. His hand, wrapped in a strip of torn towel from the bathroom, throbbed with a dull, honest pain. He welcomed it. It was real. It was his. He avoided the mirror, its cracked web a monument to his failure. Instead, he turned his forensic gaze inward, onto the only evidence that mattered now, himself and the room. Alara Moss's words echoed, a weakness in the pattern. She had been looking for a way out, a flaw in the contract. The host operated by rules, the 7 nights, the locked room, the mark. Rituals have structures, structures have vulnerabilities. His own mind, he realized, was now compromised territory. The host could manipulate his senses, mine his memories. So he had to think not with feeling, but with geometry, with space. He began with the room itself for the third time, but with a new question. Not how does something get in, but why does it need this specific box? He measured. He sketched a rough floor plan in his notebook. He noted the placement of every major fixture: the bed, the fireplace, the desk, the door. He tapped every inch of the floorboards, not for hollow spaces, but for resonance, for difference. It was under the heavy four-poster bed that he found it. He had to shove the monstrous piece of furniture aside, its feet screeching in protest on the wooden floor. The dust was thick, undisturbed for decades, and there, carved not into the floorboards themselves, but into the subfloor beneath, was a pattern. It was large, spanning almost the entire width of the room, a complex, interlocking design of lines and curves gouged deep into the wood. It was worn, ancient but unmistakable. In its center, a series of concentric circles, and radiating from that center, connecting to the larger pattern, was a shape that made his blood run cold. The exact sigil that was branded on his arm. The mark on his skin was not an isolated symbol. It was the keystone. The room itself was the grand sigil. He wasn't just in a locked room. He was standing at the epicenter of a metaphysical diagram. The lock on the door wasn't to keep the world out. It was to complete the circuit, to seal the ritual space with him, the living, marked component, inside.
"It's an amplifier," he whispered, the truth dawning with horrific clarity. The host wasn't a physical thing lurking in the walls. It was a presence, a consciousness that used the room's design and the victim's psychic energy, their fear, guilt, memory, to manifest, to gain purchase in their reality. The locked door concentrated that energy. It made the feedback loop inescapable. This was the pattern, and the weakness? As dusk fell, the cold seeped back into the room with the certainty of a tide. Leo felt a new kind of dread, colder than the air. It was the dread of violation, not of his senses, but of his will. He was examining the deadbolt, thinking about circuit breakers and interrupted rituals, when his right hand twitched. It was a small, involuntary jerk. He frowned, flexing his fingers. Then his hand rose, smoothly, calmly, and pressed against the cold iron of the bolt. No. The thought was a scream inside his skull. He tried to pull his arm back, his muscles strained, but they were no longer taking orders. His hand, his own hand, slid the bolt home with a soft, definitive click. He was locking himself in, from the inside, with a will that was not his own. Panic, pure and electric, shot through him. He fought, a silent, desperate war for control of his own limb. He managed to wrench his body away from the door, stumbling backwards. His right arm hung at his side, trembling, but his own again. The flesh is such a compliant vessel. The host's voice sighed, a note of amusement coloring the chill air. More so than the stubborn mind. We learn its pathways, its shortcuts. Leo backed away until he hit the bed frame. He clutched his rebellious hand with his left, as if pinning a treacherous animal. This was a new escalation. Sensory torment was one thing. This was occupation. The night that followed was a tense, silent siege. Leo sat rigid in a wingback chair, fighting a constant low-level impulse to get up, to walk to the window, to pick up a shard of the broken mirror. It felt like having a second nervous system, one with its own sinister agenda, humming just beneath his skin. He didn't sleep. He couldn't. To sleep was to surrender control entirely. He focused on the pattern under the bed, visible now in the slice of space he'd created. The weakness.
If the room was a circuit and he was the battery, how do you break the circuit? Not by opening the door, his own body might stop him. By removing the battery, that was death. By scrambling the signal. Elara's journal had mentioned the host feeding on the transition from belief to despair, on certainty. What if the flaw was in the victim's role? What if the ritual required not just a victim, but an unwilling participant who nonetheless believed in the power of the ritual? What if true, utter rejection of its reality, not just fear of it, but a dismissal of its very premise, was a form of interference? It was a thin hope, a philosophical gambit against a thing that could puppet his limbs, but it was all he had. As the first hint of gray lightened the window, the alien pressure on his motor nerves receded. He was spent, trembling with fatigue and spiritual revolt. He had not screamed, he had not been fed upon by memory, but he had been violated on a more fundamental level. He looked at the locked door, secured by his own possessed hand. The physical mystery was solved, the how was clear. Invitation, sigil, ritual, amplification. The lock was part of the ceremony. The real mystery now was not how the host operated. It was whether anything of Leo Mercer, his will, his reason, his self, could survive the remaining 4 nights inside the screaming, silent diagram of room 707. The unlocking he needed wasn't of the door, but of the chain his own flesh was becoming.
Night 4. The other guest. The violation of Night 3 left a stain on his psyche deeper than fear. Leo moved through the 4th day like a man checking his body for tripwires. Every twitch, every involuntary blink felt like a potential coup. He kept his left hand clamped around his right wrist, a constant physical reminder of ownership. The carved sigil on the floor, now exposed, seemed to stare up at the ceiling like a malevolent eye. He did not cover it. He needed to see it, to remember what he was trapped inside. As the 4th dusk bled into the room, a new quality settled into the cold. It wasn't just the absence of heat. It was a prescient damp, a tomb chill that promised decay. Leo sat at the desk, his notes a chaotic scramble of diagrams, questions, and frantic repetitions of Elara Moss's phrases. Weakness in the pattern, feeds on transition. The lock is inside. The first sound wasn't a whisper. It was a sob. It was soft, muffled, a woman's voice choked with a despair so profound it seemed to warp the air. It came from the corner near the fireplace, where the shadows were deepest. Leo froze, his pen slipping from his fingers. "Hello?" The sob hitched, then subsided into ragged breathing. A new voice, young, tremulous, and utterly human, filled the space. "It's making me see things in the reflections, my own hands doing things." It was Elara. Not a memory from a journal, not a hallucination. Her consciousness, her terror bleeding through the fabric of the room from a century ago. She was trapped here, not just in history, but in the residue of the ritual itself. "Who's there?" Leo asked, his voice low, urgent. "Elara? Elara Moss?" A sharp intake of breath from the darkness. You know my name? Is it over? Has it been 7 nights? Her voice was a ghost of hope, shattered by immediate, knowing dread. "No, it never ends. It just repurposes." Leo rose slowly, approaching the corner not as a threat, but as a fellow investigator in a shared nightmare. "I'm Leo. I'm in room 707. I have your journal." A silence. Then a sound like fingers brushing against plaster. "The Grand Victoria. He favors the old places, the ones with sorrow in the mortar. It's stronger here. The pattern.
It's in the foundations. How do I break it? The question tore from him, stripped of pride, of rationality. It was a plea. Her voice shifted, growing closer, as if she were kneeling just on the other side of the veil. It feeds on the transition, she whispered, the words spilling out in a frantic, breathless rush. From belief to despair, from hope to certainty. That's the feast. Your terror is the appetizer. Your surrender is the main course.
A sudden, violent hiss erupted from the dusty radiator under the window, a blast of steam and heat that made Leo jump. Alara's voice surged through the metallic gurgle, sharp and clear. "Don't let it have your certainty." The radiator fell silent. The cold rushed back in, deeper than before. "It doesn't like us talking." Alara's voice was fading, stretching thin. "It collects us, isolates us, makes us think we're alone. That's part of the digestion." "Ilara, wait! A weakness! You said there was a weakness!" Her final words were a mere breath, carried on a current of ice from the grate. "The contract is for the soul, but the mind is the lockpick. It never thinks we try to think our way out." She was gone. The corner was just a corner, but the echo of her presence remained, a fragile solidarity in the haunted dark. The host did not speak that night. It didn't need to. The introduction of Alara was a masterstroke of psychological torture. It showed him his future, not death, but an eternity as a whispering stain on this room, a companion for the next poor soul marked by the brand. Her warnings just another layer of the haunting. It was a fate worse than screams. But she had also given him a weapon, a real one. Don't let it have your certainty. The host fed on the shift from hope to despair, from belief in escape to the absolute certainty of doom. What if he could freeze the transition? What if he could refuse to play the emotional game entirely? He looked at the sigil on the floor, then at his own marked arm. The ritual required a participant, an active participant, churning out the psychic fuel of despair. What if he could become inert, not hopeful, not despairing, just observant, a rock in the stream of its intent? It was madness. It was the only sane plan he had left. For the rest of the night, Leo practiced. When a familiar creeping fear began to knot his stomach, the fear of his body being taken over again, he did not fight it. He did not embrace it. He noted it clinically. Elevated heart rate, adrenal response, subject, fear of loss of autonomy. He narrated his own terror in the dispassionate tone of a forensic report. When a mournful, whispering sound coiled through the room, he did not speculate on its meaning or source. He described it. Auditory phenomenon, low frequency, possibly resonant vibration in plumbing. He was deconstructing the haunting in real time, refusing to be its audience, casting himself instead as its unimpressed technician. He felt the host's attention on him, a palpable, frustrated pressure. It was used to screams, to sobs, to the delicious collapse of a mind. It didn't know what to do with this sterile, stubborn cataloging. As dawn broke, Leo was exhausted but not broken. He had not given it a scream. He had given it field notes. Ilara's voice was gone, but her warning remained, a fragile thread in the labyrinth. The host had shown him a possible eternity of torment. In response, Leo had offered it a bored, clinical stare. The war was no longer for his body or even his senses. It was for the narrative. And for the first time, Leo Mercer felt a flicker of something the host could not digest. Not hope, not yet, but defiance, wrapped in the cold, hard steel of reason. Night 5, The Hollowing.
The clinical detachment of Night 4 had been a shield. On the 5th day, Leo discovered it was also a provocation. The silence from the host was not absence. It was the quiet of a chef sharpening knives. The cold in room 707 no longer seeped. It resided, a permanent winter that had settled into the bones of the building and the marrow of Leo's own bones. The mark on his arm was no longer just a brand. It felt like a socket, as if something were slowly, meticulously unscrewing his essence from its moorings. As the 5th night descended, the attack did not come through whispered threats or phantom smells. It came through memory. Leo was examining the pattern on the floor, tracing its lines in his notebook, when a memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. It was his 9th birthday. His father, a stern, taciturn man, had given him a model kit of a forensic investigation van. For the little detective, he'd said, the closest he ever came to approval. The memory was warm, precise, the smell of the plastic, the weight of the box, the rare smile on his father's face. Then, the memory twitched. In his mind's eye, his father's smile stretched, thinning into something humorless and sharp. "You'll never solve the things that matter," the memory father said, his voice a perfect replica layered with the host's oily resonance. The model van in little Leo's hands melted, becoming a twisted lump of dark plastic. The warm light of the kitchen turned the cold, flat gray of room 707's dusk. Leo gasped, dropping his pen. It was a violation more intimate than any touch. The host wasn't just showing him nightmares, it was editing his past, corrupting the source code of his identity. "Memory is the foundation of self," the host's voice murmured, this time from within his own skull, a thought that was not his own. "And foundations can be remodeled." The assault accelerated. A cherished memory of his sister Clara teaching him to ride a bike mutated into a scene where she laughed as he fell, skinning his knees. A proud moment of his forensic career, cracking a difficult case, rewrote itself into a moment of overlooked evidence that had condemned an innocent man. Each one was a tiny, precise incision, separating him from the person he believed himself to be. He stumbled to the vanity, avoiding his own shattered reflection in the large mirror, and looked into the small, intact one on the medicine cabinet. The face that stared back was his, but the eyes, they were changing. The weary, intelligent hazel seemed duller, flecked with a cold, observing gray. It was the look of a tenant assessing a newly acquired, dilapidated property.
"What are you doing?" Leo demanded, his voice cracking. "Making space," the host replied simply, its voice now a dual-toned horror, his own vocal cords in the real world and its own chilling whisper in his mind. "The vessel must be emptied before it can be properly filled. Your certainty, your history, your guilt, all just clutter. I am curating." A new, more terrifying symptom began. Gaps. He would reach for a word, stapler, nostalgia, periwinkle, and find only a blank wall in his mind. He tried to recall his mother's favorite song and heard only static. These were not the stolen, edited memories, but voids where memories had been removed, extracted. He was being hollowed out, not with rage, but with a terrifying, meticulous care. The ultimate violation came near midnight. Leo, fighting to anchor himself, began reciting facts aloud. "My name is Leo Mercer. I was born in Hartford. I worked for the State Forensics Division for 12 years. I host a podcast called Unsealed." He took a breath to continue. His mouth opened. "I
a different voice came out. It was his own vocal timbre, but the cadence, the inflection was alien, polished, and cold. The subject's name is Leo Mercer, a suitable vessel, moderate resilience, intelligence present but pliable under sufficient pressure. The assimilation of core memories is 40% complete, motor function integration tested and viable. He was narrating his own dissolution in the host's clinical tone. He clapped his hands over his mouth, silencing the traitorous voice, but the report continued seamlessly inside his head. He was no longer just fighting a ghost in a room. He was fighting a cancer in his consciousness. The host wasn't merely possessing him, it was replacing him, file by corrupted file. The locked room was now his own skull, and the thing inside was changing the locks on every door. Dawn on the 5th day brought no relief, only a terrifying inventory. He could still remember Clara's face, but the love he associated with it felt distant, like a story he'd been told about someone else. The passion for justice that had driven his career felt like a theoretical concept. He was becoming a shell, furnished with the ghostly afterimages of a life, awaiting a new, permanent occupant. He looked at his reflection, the hollowed eyes, the slackening expression. The man in the mirror was less Leo Mercer with each passing hour. He was becoming a preliminary sketch, a rough draft. The host had shown him its endgame. It didn't want his screams. It didn't even want his soul in the abstract. It wanted his address.
Night 6. The bargain. By the 6th day, the hollowing was a physical sensation. Leo felt like a glass figurine, fragile and empty, with only the faintest echo of his own thoughts rattling around inside. The memories the host had not edited or erased felt thin, two-dimensional. He remembered his sister's name, but the sound of her laughter was gone. He knew he had been an investigator, but the driving hunger for truth felt like a rumor about a stranger. The worst was the silence in his own mind. The constant internal monologue, the narrator of his life, had been subdued, replaced by a watchful, calculating quiet that was not his own. He was a house where the owner had been quietly evicted and the new tenant was moving furniture in the attic. As the 6th dusk invaded the room, Leo did not set up his equipment. The cameras were useless. The audio recorder was a mockery. He sat in the center of the carved sigil on the floor, his back to the bed, facing the door. He was waiting, not as prey, but as a negotiator with nothing left to lose. The cold arrived not as a wave, but as a solidification. The air grew still and heavy, like water just before it freezes. The shadows in the corner of the room didn't deepen, they congealed, drawing substance from the very darkness until they formed a shape. A man-shaped absence, a silhouette of absolute void that drank the light around it. From within that silhouette, the host spoke. Its voice was no longer a whisper in the air or a thought in his head. It was a clear, resonant presence vibrating in Leo's sternum. "You are nearly ready." Leo looked at the void shape. He felt no fear. The capacity for it had been scraped away. What for? For occupancy, for use. Your resilience has been admirable. It has made the vessel stronger. And then what? You walk out of here in my skin? Host a podcast on how to arrange your own damnation? The silhouette seemed to ripple with something like amusement. The world is full of locked rooms, Leo. Human hearts, criminal schemes, forgotten places. I enjoy solving them from the inside.
You will be my next set of lockpicks. The horror of it was cosmic, and yet it barely registered in his hollowed core. This was the fate worse than death or ghostly whispers, to be a puppet, a conscious tool used to orchestrate more misery, to lure others into this same trap, to be the curator's assistant in his own museum of souls. I won't do it, Leo said, his voice flat. You have no agency left to refuse. The process is nearly complete. Then why are you talking to me? Why not just finish it? A final spark, the last ember of his rationality, flickered. You want something you can't just take. The heavy silence stretched. The void shape pulsed once, slowly. You are correct, the host conceded, its tone shifting to one of intellectual curiosity. The final integration requires a capitulation, a relinquishment. It is more elegant when the vessel understands and yields. The alternative is messier, a flawed instrument. It needed his surrender, his certainty of defeat. That was the final ingredient. Alara was right. It fed on the transitions. The ultimate feast was the moment the mind accepted its new owner. Leo saw his opening. It was a crack thinner than a hair, but it was there. A bargain, he said, the words leaving his lips before he fully thought them through. You have nothing with which to bargain. I have this. Leo topped his own temple, a hollow sound. You want my capitulation. You want it clean. I'll give it to you, but on one condition. The cold intensified, a warning. Speak. You said you enjoy solving locked rooms. So do I. It's who I am. Was. He took a breath, the air like shards of glass in his lungs. Give me your locked room. Not this one. He gestured to the physical room. The real one. The metaphysical paradox. How are you here with the door locked? Explain the mechanism, not with whispers and nightmares, logically, as one professional to another. Let me solve it. Let me understand. He leaned forward, the ember in his chest glowing hotter. If I solve it, you take only what you originally came for, the guilt for my sister's death. You leave the rest of me, my memories, my mind, and you go. The contract is fulfilled on that single item. And if you fail, the host's voice was a low, thrilling vibration. Then you get your clean capitulation. I yield. You get the vessel, intact and willing. No mess, a perfect integration. The offer hung in the frozen air. He was gambling everything on the one pillar left standing in the ruin of his mind, his reason. He was appealing to the entity's vanity, its pride and its own twisted artistry, as one professional to another. The void shape shifted, considering. The temptation was exquisite. To have the rationalist, the solver, understand and then surrender, it was a more profound victory than mere destruction. The bargain is struck, the host said, the words final as a judge's gavel. Dawn is in 6 hours, 12 minutes. Solve my paradox by then. Use what you have learned. The clock begins now. The silhouette dissolved, the crushing pressure lifting slightly, leaving only the intense, focused cold. The trial was no longer of terror, but of intellect, the ultimate locked room mystery. Leo closed his eyes not to block out the room, but to focus inward. He had 6 hours to decipher the nature of a demon. He thought of the carved sigil beneath him, the mark on his skin, the locked door. He thought of sensory manipulation, memory editing, motor control. He thought of Alara's warnings. It feeds on the transition. It was already there. The pieces began to click,
not in a flash of inspiration, but with the grinding, deliberate certainty of a vault dial turning. The host wasn't an external entity breaking in. It was an internal one invited out. The mark was the invitation. The guilt, the fear, the shame, these were not just food, they were the building blocks of its manifestation. The locked room ritual created a pressurized psychic crucible where a person's own darkness could be distilled, given shape and voice, and turned against them. The host was the sentient shape of that distilled negativity. It was a haunting born from the tenant, not the house. The door was locked from the inside because the monster was built from the materials inside the mind. It didn't enter, it emerged. It was a psychological parasite with a metaphysical life cycle, using ritual and belief as its womb. He had the theory, the how, but the bargain was to solve the paradox, to state the mechanism. He needed the clean, elegant proof. He opened his eyes, staring at the locked door. The answer was in the very first question everyone asked about a locked room mystery. He spoke aloud, his voice steady in the frozen dark. The solution to the locked room is that there was no murder. He let the words hang. The air seemed to listen. In a classic sense, no external actor entered to commit a crime. The death, the horror, was an inside job. The victim and the perpetrator are the same. He took a breath. You are not a separate entity, host. You are a symptom, a malignant, self-aware symptom of a soul under a specific, ritualistic strain. The mark isn't your claim. It's the trigger for the psychic autoimmune disease. The locked room is the isolation chamber where the disease can fully progress without interference, where the mind can fully turn against itself and give that self-hatred a name and a voice. You. The silence was absolute. He pressed on. That's why you need the lock. That's why you need the fear. That's why you feed on transitions. You are the manifestation of the collapse. You don't exist without it. The paradox isn't how you got in. The paradox is believing you were ever out. You are the locked room. For a long moment, nothing happened. Had he failed? Had he misunderstood? Then a sound filled the room. It was slow, deliberate, and utterly chilling. Applause. A single pair of hands clapping with measured, appreciative force from the center of the room where the void had been. Excellently reasoned, the host's voice whispered, brimming with genuine delight. An elegant, almost beautiful solution. You have indeed solved the paradox. Leo's heart, a frozen lump in his chest, dared to beat once, hard. And in solving it, the host's voice continued, the whisper hardening as a blade of ice. You have proven yourself more valuable, more unique than I ever anticipated. A vessel that can not only withstand the process, but understand it. That is a prize beyond measure. The bargain is forfeit. Your guilt was merely the key in the lock. Now I will take the entire house. The cold slammed into Leo with the force of a physical blow. The final crushing certainty, not of defeat, but of a trap he had walked into with his eyes wide open, descended. He had solved the mystery, and in doing so, he had lost everything.
Night 7. The Devil's Proof. The applause died, leaving a silence more terrible than any whisper. The host's betrayal was absolute, flawless. Leo had walked perfectly into the final trap, using his reason to deliver his own soul on a platter of understanding. The cold wasn't just in the air now, it was in the pathways of his brain, crystallizing his thoughts, frosting the windows of his consciousness from the inside. He could feel the host's presence consolidating, shifting from an invader to a rightful owner surveying the premises. The hollowed-out spaces within him yawned wider, eager to be filled with something ancient and cold. He had been so clever, so damnably clever, and in his cleverness he had handed the entity the final key. The key. The thought was a faint spark in the frozen darkness of his mind. Not the physical brass key from the parcel, the other key, the one Ilara had mentioned in her final fragmented warning. The mind is the lockpick. He had solved the how, but the host had said, "Solve my locked room." He'd presented a theory, a psychological model, but a locked room mystery wasn't solved until you revealed the trick, the physical, actionable flaw. The host was a symptom, a malignant, self-aware symptom born of guilt, ritual, and isolation. Its power was belief, his certainty in its reality, its rules, its power. That belief gave it shape, voice, and strength. What was the one weapon against a thing made of your own certainty? Doubt. Not the doubt of fear, but the doubt of rejection. Not maybe it's real, but the defiant, absolute, "I do not accept your premise." He had tried clinical detachment. It had been a shield, but not a sword. He needed something more fundamental. He needed to break the story. The host's presence swirled around him, a vortex of eager cold. The integration is beginning. Feel the clarity, Leo, the peace of no more struggle. Leo made his body go limp. He stopped fighting the cold. He stopped clinging to the tattered remnants of his memories. He let himself feel the vast, empty silence within. He was a shell, a vessel. And then, from the very bottom of that emptiness, he found the one thing the host could not digest, could not corrupt, because it was not a memory, not an emotion. It was a choice. He opened his eyes. He did not look at the void shape. He did not address the host. He looked down at his own hand, at the gray branded flesh. "You're wrong." His voice was quiet, but it did not echo. It was absorbed by the room, a stone dropped into a tar pit. There is no more right or wrong. There is only what is. "No," Leo said, and now he looked up, not at the manifestation, but at the locked door. "I solved your paradox, but you lied about the bargain. You're a liar, and a lie has no power once it's seen. I have all power here." The voice held the first note of something other than smooth assurance, a flicker of annoyance. "You have the power I gave you, the power of my belief, the power of my guilt. That's the fuel, that's the lock." He raised his branded arm. "This isn't your mark, it's mine. It's a scar of my own making, a story I told myself was true." He was speaking pure, reckless blasphemy against the reality of the last 6 nights. He was denying the evidence of his senses, his memories, his very pain. "You are mad, the final stage."
"Maybe," Leo conceded, a strange calm settling over him. It was the calm of the cliff's edge. "But if I'm mad, then none of this is real. You're not real. You're a fever dream, a psychotic break. And if you're not real, he turned his gaze to the center of the room where the presence was strongest, then you can't stop me from leaving. He took a step toward the door. The cold became a physical wall, a paralyzing force. It was like wading through liquid nitrogen. You cannot. The room is sealed. The contract is binding. The contract is a story. The seal is in my mind. Another step. His muscles screamed, burning with the cold. He thought of the brass key in his pocket, not to unlock the door, a focus, a symbol. His symbol, not theirs. Alara was right. You feed on the transition from belief to despair, but you need the belief first. You need me to believe in you. He was at the door. The immense iron deadbolt was thrown. He reached out a trembling hand. Touch it, and I will unmake what is left of you, the host snarled, its voice shedding all pretense of civility, becoming a raw, chittering thing of infinite winter. He pressed his palm against the cold metal. He didn't try to turn it. He closed his eyes. I revoke my belief, he whispered, the words a spell in the negative. I deny your story. I deny your power. I deny your existence. You are a ghost in a machine of my own making, and I am shutting down the machine. He focused everything, every scrap of will not yet eroded, every spark of identity not yet stolen, into a single silent declaration. This is not real. The room seemed to hold its breath. The pressure was immense, a mountain on his soul. And then, from within the silence of his own skull, he heard it. Not the host's voice, a memory of Ilara's, clear as a bell. The mind is the lockpick. The key wasn't physical, it was perspective. It was the choice to see the prison not as walls of oak and iron, but as walls of fear and story. And a story could be changed. He opened his eyes. He spoke to the door, to the room, to the parasite in his psyche. The bargain is void. I solved your paradox. You are not in the room with me. I was in the room with myself. All of this is just a conversation I'm having in the dark, and I am done talking. He took the old brass key from his pocket. It was not a tool for the physical lock. It was a prop, a totem. He pressed its cold, intricate bow directly against the cold brand on his arm. A jolt went through him, not of pain, but of sudden, shocking alignment. The metal against the scar, the symbol of the invitation meeting the symbol of the acceptance, a circuit completed and then shorted. He poured his will into that point of contact, not a plea, a command, a reversal. I am leaving. For a second, nothing. Then, a sound. Clunk. It was the heavy, oiled, final sound of the iron deadbolt sliding back, not by his hand. The mechanism moved on its own, retracting into the door. The impossible physical proof of an impossible mental victory. The terrible, grasping cold shattered like glass. The oppressive presence in the room didn't withdraw. It unraveled with a soundless cry of furious disbelief. The shadows snapped back to mere corners. The air lost its deathly weight. Leo stood, swaying, before the unlocked door. The brass key in his hand was now warm. The mark on his arm blazed with a final white-cold agony before the sensation faded, leaving only a dull, silvery ache. He didn't look back. He turned the handle. The door to room 707 swung open silently onto the empty, dusty hallway. He stepped across the threshold. He was not a vessel. He was not a solved mystery. He was a man, hollowed and scarred, walking out of a story he decided to stop telling. The devil's proof was not in the possession.
It was in the release, and the lock, he now knew, had always been on the inside. Dawn. The hallway air was still and tomb-dusty, but it was just air. It held no whispered commentary, no invasive chill. The silence was empty, not watchful. Leo leaned against the wall opposite room 707, his legs trembling, the simple act of breathing a monumental effort. He half expected the door to slam shut, for Vale to appear, for the nightmare to reset. Nothing happened. Slowly, he pushed himself upright. He looked down at his forearm. The raised, angry brand was gone. In its place was a scar, smooth, silvery, and faint, the shape of the sigil still visible, but now looking like an old, poorly remembered tattoo. It was no longer cold, it was just skin. He became aware of his own body, aching, starving, parched, and humming with a fatigue so deep it felt spiritual. He was a vase that had been shattered and glued back together. The outline was the same, but the cracks would always show. He walked down the 7 flights of stairs, each step an echo in the profound silence. The grand lobby was as empty as before, the dust sheets like sleeping beasts. The morning light through the grimy front windows was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, banal, yellow, and real. As he approached the front doors, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the reception desk, Mr. Vale. He was as impeccably composed as ever, but his wintry eyes held a new, sharp intensity as they scanned Leo from head to toe, lingering on the silver scar now visible on his exposed forearm. "Mr. Mercer," Vale's voice was careful, neutral. "Your investigation is concluded?" "It is," Leo said, his own voice rough from disuse. "We trust the accommodations were illuminating?" Leo met his gaze. He saw no mockery there, only a deep professional assessment. Vale was a custodian, not a believer, a janitor for the supernatural. They were exactly as advertised. A faint, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of Vale's mouth. Was it disappointment? Respect? "Your compensation," Vale said, producing a plain, sealed envelope from his jacket. He held it out, not stepping closer. Leo took it. It was thin. He didn't open it. He knew it wouldn't contain money. "And discretion?" Leo asked. "As guaranteed. Your presence here is a matter between you and the curators. We have no record." Vale's pale eyes flickered toward the staircase. "The room will be refurbished." Leo knew what that meant. The sigil would be covered, the door would be repainted, the stage would be reset for the next invited guest. The Grand Victoria would continue its silent, hungry existence. He nodded, turned, and pushed through the heavy oak doors into the mundane shock of a city morning. The sounds of traffic, the smell of exhaust and damp concrete, the glare of the sun. It was an overwhelming assault on senses refined to a razor's edge in a silent, frozen box. He stood on the steps, the envelope crumpled in his fist, and simply breathed. A week later, Leo sat in his own apartment. The familiar clutter felt like a museum of a past life. He had slept for almost 24 hours straight, eaten and showered on a loop, trying to scrub the residual chill from his bones. He finally opened Vale's envelope. Inside was a single heavy cardstock note. No money, no explanation, just 3 words, embossed in elegant black letters.
Paid in full. He threw it in the trash. Then, after a moment, he fished it out and burned it in his kitchen sink, watching the ash swirl down the drain. He returned to work. His podcast listeners had noticed his absence. He recorded a short, quiet episode. He didn't mention the Grand Victoria, or marks, or devils. He spoke about the concept of the locked room itself. "We think the mystery is the physical space," he said, his voice quieter, slatter than before. "The bolted door, the barred window. But sometimes the real locked room is psychological, a prison of guilt or grief, or a story we tell ourselves so convincingly we forget we're the authors. The solution is never about finding a hidden key. It's about realizing the door you're banging on is the one you closed yourself, and that you can choose to stop banging and just walk away." He didn't take questions. He signed off. The messages started trickling in. Listeners who found it profound, and others, a darker subset. Emails with subject lines like "The Mark" and "7 Nights," photos attached, blurry shots of strange blemishes on skin, anxious queries written in the small hours, stories of whispers, of cold spots, of irrational dread. He read every one. He wrote back the same thing each time, a mantra forged in the heart of room 707. The door only locks from the inside. Whatever you fear most, whatever guilt you carry, do not prepare a room for it. Do not give it a name. Turn on the light. The lock is yours. So is the key. He didn't know if it would help, but it was the only truth he had left to offer. One night, months later, the nightmare returned. Not the corridor, not the voice, a simpler, colder horror. He woke at 3:33 a.m., the scent of jasmine and smoke fading from his nostrils, a silent scream locked in his throat. The apartment was dark. The silver scar on his arm itched, a phantom cold. And on the very edge of hearing, woven into the hum of the refrigerator, a familiar, oiled leather voice whispered from the dark corner of the room, the corner where the light from the street lamp never quite reached. "I do so admire a well-solved puzzle, Leo. But remember," the whisper coiled through the room, intimate and vile, "a key can turn both ways, and some doors, once opened, can never be truly closed again." The whisper faded. The room was just a room. The scar was just a scar. Leo Mercer sat in the dark, awake until dawn, watching the corner where the shadows clung thickest. He knew now that some escapes were not clean. Some victories left a residue. The devil's proof was not in the possession, nor even in the release. It was in the permanent, silent knowing that a part of the locked room had followed him out, and it was waiting, patiently, for the lights to go out again.
Epilogue. The scar never faded completely. It remained a silvery cipher on his skin, a receipt for a transaction he still didn't fully understand. Leo Mercer learned to live with it, as one learns to live with a stiff knee that predicts the rain, a permanent, quiet reminder of a past storm. He never returned to the Grand Victoria. He sometimes saw its peaked roofline in the distance, a dark cutout against the sky, and felt a hollow twinge in his gut, a reflex as primal as a prey animal spotting a hidden hunter. He changed his jogging route to avoid it. His podcast, Unsealed, evolved. The cases he chose were colder, drier, more focused on forensic minutiae and procedural failures. He shied away from the purely sensational, the stories that smelled of brimstone and old fear. His audience noticed the shift. Some left, craving the earlier, spookier tone. A smaller, more dedicated group stayed, sensing a new gravity in his work, a depth paid for in a currency they couldn't name. The messages still came, the photos of strange marks, the rambling accounts of 7-day dread.
He answered each one with his standardized reply about locks and keys. It was a ritual, a ward. He hoped it helped. He knew for some it wouldn't. Once a year, around the anniversary of his week in room 707, he would receive a postcard, never signed, always a photograph of an old, imposing building, a forgotten asylum, a shuttered museum, a derelict manor house. On the back, a single letter, V. He never kept them. He burned each one, watching the corners curl and blacken, the images of potential future prisons turning to harmless ash. Life, in its stubborn way, moved on. He had a relationship for a while, a pragmatic, gentle woman named Claire who worked as an archivist. She asked about the scar once, tracing its lines with a curious finger. An old burn, he'd said, a stupid accident. She'd accepted the answer, and he'd loved her a little for not pressing, for letting some rooms in him stay locked. It didn't last, but it ended kindly, a door closing without a slam. The work was his anchor. He solved puzzles of flesh and blood, of greed and malice. Human horrors were messy, ugly, but they had edges. They could be filed, understood, and sometimes, with great effort, put right. There was a clean exhaustion in that. But in the quiet moments, in the space between heartbeats when the world held its breath, he remembered the feeling of his own hand betraying him, the taste of blood that was water, the hollow intellectual applause of the void, and Alara's voice, a ghost in a machine, urging him to think. He had thought his way out. He was sure of it. And yet, on the bad nights when the city noise faded to a hum and the dark in his apartment felt too thick, he would sometimes catch a flicker in the periphery, not a shape, just a motion where there should be none. The silver scar would prickle with a distinct phantom cold, like an old radio picking up a station from a continent away. He would turn on every light then, flooding the apartment with a blinding, prosaic glare. He would make tea or put on a documentary about deep-sea fish and wait for dawn. He had won. He had solved the devil's locked room and walked out. He had paid the price and sealed the door behind him. But victory, he had learned, is not the same as safety. It is not an erasure. It is a fragile truce signed in scar tissue under a sky that watches with a cold, impersonal interest. The devil's sign was no longer on his skin, but the knowledge of the locked room, the smell of its dust, the texture of its silence, the architecture of its despair was now a part of him, woven into the fabric of his nerves. He carried the blueprint of the prison within him, and a blueprint, in the right hands or the wrong ones, can always be used to build again. He lived, he worked, he breathed the free air, and in the deepest dark he listened, not with fear, but with the weary vigilance of a sentry who knows the war is never truly over, only paused, waiting for the moment when the key, in whatever hand it now resided, might begin to turn once more.